some action. And this is really gets into the pricing framework of how we can actually understand where those customers are. And we're going to walk through an example just because it's, it's one of those things where using data and using some context. And the example we're going to use is actually super personal to us. We like to use customer data, but unfortunately, customers don't really like us using customer data. And so we're going to talk through a little bit about how we launched ProfitWell. And I gave a really kind of brief, rambly overview of what we do. But when we started the company as Price Intelligently, about 2 years in, we were helping a company that was about to IPO with their pricing, their product pricing. And what we discovered as this outside vendor is that they were calculating their MRR, their monthly recurring revenue, completely incorrectly. So basically, we were living, we were with a company that was about to IPO. The head of finance had taken 2 other companies public. And this really, really crucial number, kind of like looking at your bank account and basically reading the number incorrectly, that person was getting this wrong. And so we were super excited. We were like, this is the idea of the century. We're going to build a dashboard. It's going to plug into their billing system. It's going to be amazing. We're going to be rich. Let's get down payments on Ferraris. Like it was all crazy. We were really excited. The problem was after we built this MVP, and it didn't look like what you're seeing today, all of a sudden, when we were about to kind of officially launch, what we noticed is that we were in a deeply competitive market. So about 4 weeks before we launched, there was a company called Baremetrics that launched. About 4 weeks after we launched, there was a company called ChartMogul that launched. And then there was just this huge long tail of individuals that basically, had all types of different analytics products. So some folks were using Domo, Insight Squared, and if anyone's worked in the analytics space, there's just tons of different analytics products. And so we were pretty upset. We were like very crestfallen because we were so excited and we're like, this is the idea, this is something that we can build. And what we did is we didn't necessarily scrap the entire idea, but we were like, okay, we need to figure out who is going to value this and if they're going to value this. And so what we did is we stopped building, we stopped guessing and checking. We didn't do anything except just kind of bug maintenance. And what we ended up doing is we started talking to our customer. And if you don't take anything away from this presentation, the one thing that you have to do is start talking to your customer. Set up some sort of feedback queue where feedback's coming in. If it's qualitative, it's quantitative, whatever it is, set it up so that, maybe you're going to talk to 10 customers on, over coffee or over lunch in a given month. Just set something up so that you can start getting that information. Mainly because when you get more information, it'll start answering some questions, and then those questions or those answers will beget more questions, and you'll get into a nice cycle where basically, there's just a ton of stuff where you'll start to kind of funnel that particular information. Now, there's a number of ways that you can do this, but the way that we're going to teach you today, it's kind of a good mix of qualitative and quantitative, and it really comes down to getting the data to build your own little 2x2 matrix that we were showing you before. And that really comes down to value-based pricing. So we've all probably heard this phrase value-based pricing before, but it's probably some sort of Forbes article that was like, hey, you need to do value-based pricing, and then didn't really say what that is. But value-based pricing, it basically comes down to understanding your customer, where they see value, and then pricing based on that, which I understand is still pretty vague. And so we'll get into specifically how to do that. But what value-based pricing isn't is cost plus and competitive based pricing, which is what a lot of us end up doing within our businesses. So what I mean by that is cost plus pricing. It's exactly how it sounds. You basically find your costs, you slap an arbitrary margin on top of it, and you kind of call it a day. And the problem with this is that your customers, they don't care about your costs, they care about their costs. And in addition to that, a lot of us are working in some sort of technology business. And so what ends up happening is our technology probably is going to give much, much more value relative to the cost per user. Now, on the competitive side, what you're doing is you're assuming that your competitors have done their homework. And most data indicates that your competitors have probably not done their homework. And you're also assuming that your competitors are basically selling the same product to the same customer, which probably also isn't true. And it's not to say that this data isn't important, but it is to say that essentially when you're looking at your pricing, your value-based data, which we're going to go through in a second here, that data should basically form the central piece of what you're doing when it comes to your pricing, and your costs and your competitors should basically be secondary or tertiary data points. So to give you an example, if we find out that our customers are only willing to pay $100, but the cost is $150, That doesn't mean that you automatically just raise the price to $150. It means you probably need to figure out your costs, which normally isn't the case, or find a new customer or find a new product to basically sell to that particular customer base. And when you use this data in context, that's where there's a lot of really pushing forward within your pricing strategy. And so the first thing that we recommend doing is, and this is just because it acts as a fulcrum to actually doing the testing, is basically starting with a draft of your buyer personas. And I know that, Grandpa Marketo and Grandma HubSpot have been talking about personas for a decade now. But what's really kind of interesting is that a lot of us, we just kind of give them cute names and maybe cute faces. We don't actually get into the quantitative side of what buyers look like. And so when I talk about buyer personas, I mean essentially putting together profiles of who you're targeting. And those profiles can be separated based on size, meaning, startups versus mid-enterprise versus enterprise, or they can be based on roles, marketers, salespeople, et cetera. But then giving some hypotheses around what are the most valued features? What are the least valued features? What's the lifetime value look like? What's the willingness to pay look like? And even the customer acquisition cost. And you can make this an endless stream of different information, but it's one of those things where it's really, really important to at least get this down on paper, because what we're going to do is we're going to start validating this with data and validating it with research. But even if you just get to this stage, what you'll end up doing is you'll have this central document where you can argue with yourselves internally around, well, why are we building that feature? This person doesn't want that. Or shouldn't we build this particular feature because that person really values that within their business? And so this is something where it's super, super important to basically get this kind of centralized within, your understanding of your team. Now, the way that we're going to validate this is through the pricing process. And the pricing process, it's pretty straightforward, but it does require some work. But what's kind of cool about it is it goes back to basically what we all typically want in our business is data, data, and more data. And the way that we actually are going to formulate that data is using probably something that you learned in about 5th grade, which is the scientific method. So basically what that means is we're going to go out, we're going to design an experimental design, which is just a fancy jargon for who are we going to ask what questions, or which questions I should say. We're going to take that data, we're going to run it through some basic statistical models, and I promise you they're basic. You can make them super complicated if you want, but we're going to teach kind of the basic ones you can do in Excel, because you get a lot of efficiency and just a lot of power for the amount of work that you have to put in. That's going to validate those buyer personas, and that's going to help us make those pricing decisions. And so each of the steps of this process allows us to basically collect data in essentially a framework manner. And using that framework, it allows us to then, basically earn our paycheck and make decisions based on enough data to at least be informed and at least hedge a lot of the risks that you might have. Now, the way that we're going to collect this data is by using 2 methodologies. One is called the relative preference analysis, and this is just that x-axis on that 2x2. So the taste, the temperature, the country of origin for like that cup of coffee. And then the price sensitivity, which is basically what everyone wants to know, which is kind of price elasticity and like how much people are willing to pay, or that y-axis on that example. And the way that we're going to get this data is through surveys. And I almost guarantee most people on the phone are not like enamored with surveys. A lot of us hate surveys. And I that kind of breaks my heart a little bit, because I think that a lot of times it's not that surveys are bad. It's just that we're really bad at sending or constructing surveys. And what I mean by that is surveys are an extremely powerful tool within your arsenal. But the issue is that a lot of us just kind of overuse them. And I'll give you an example, and it's literally an example I've been talking about for years now, because it's always true and always relevant. The last survey I can actually remember this. I received a survey last week, and the first question on the survey, it was 45 questions long. It was emailed to me, and the first question on the survey was, "What's your email address?" So basically the person that was sending me this survey, and it was not compensated either, they were basically disrespecting my time. Like, not necessarily intentionally and not nefariously, but basically what happened inside that company is people were like, "Oh, we haven't collected survey data in a while. We're going to send a survey. We got 5 questions. Do you have any questions?" And then everyone around inside the organization wanted to add their questions. And the issue is, and we've learned this after sending, tons of surveys over the years, is that if your survey is over 4 minutes in length, you probably just shouldn't send it. mainly because it's not the response rate that's going to go down, just the quality of responses are going to go down pretty dramatically. And really, like, surveys in an ideal form, if they're not compensated, should be 30 to 60 seconds long. The less questions you can have, the better, and that requires you to be a little bit better around understanding what you should ask. And so that's why we say, hate the play it, don't hate the game. Surveys, it's not surveys' fault. They're actually really, really good. And some other objections that come up is, no one answers surveys. Well, if you properly set up how you're collecting surveys, either using something like Qualaroo, where you're just getting constant feedback outside your application or inside your application, or whether you're kind of setting up, something that properly goes out to folks via email, you can actually get a lot of people to answer surveys properly. And we've sent about 40 million of these things at this point. Our Price Intelligently product, our algorithms are basically fed through surveys. And it's something where we found a lot of people answer surveys. Other objections, what if you don't have anyone to survey? This is a really big objection. Frankly, you have website traffic, so you have folks that can come and answer questions. You probably have prospects. But even if you truly don't have anyone, you're starting from scratch or you're trying to get into a new market, there's entire industries called market panelists that are basically exist to help you get someone to answer a survey at 15 minutes at a time. Now, they cost different amounts depending on who you're targeting. A soccer mom or dad in Kansas is going to cost you probably about $1 per response. A Fortune 500 CIO is going to cost you hundreds of dollars per response, but there definitely are companies out there. And then the question of bias, right? A lot of people that talk about how biased surveys can be, and they're not untrue. But the thing is that all data that you have is going to have bias of some form. The secret is understanding the limits of your data. So what I mean by that is if you ask in the right manner, if you clean the data up correctly, if you do kind of best practices around survey design, you can basically control for a lot of bias. There's still going to be bias, but you also have to understand the gravity of the decision you're making. If I'm going to test some ad copy, I'm probably not going to ask 1,500 people about that ad copy. Now, if I'm going to make a $10 million decision, I'm probably not just going to ask a couple of people, on the phone about their opinions, right? The data basically drives, or the decision basically drives how quality of data that you need, and asking in the right manner really helps. And so I'm going to pause there because I know, Michael, you guys have so much experience in this as well. So I'd love to get, what you think on this as well.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. I would love to jump in a little bit. Just as you mentioned there at the beginning of this section, you have your buyer persona and the certain attributes that are necessary to understand what you want to look for in an ideal buyer in any of those different categories you have. But the same goes for a user persona. Once they've purchased, they're now a user, and they have certain attributes that you want to flag as being important. So what you can do with that information is come up with, okay, what are the attributes that are most important to us right now? And then know who you're talking to and know which questions are relevant for those particular users by segmenting based on those attributes. So, to help supplement, your users will answer your questions if they're relevant to them. So if I'm going to ask you a very specific question about a feature you're using, you're more likely to give me some very relevant feedback. And when you do that at scale, let's say you have a website where you can then flag, okay, I want to ask these questions to these particular users based on these attributes that they have behind the login wall, for example, you're going to get a lot of very helpful information that'll also reduce bias simply because you are asking the right user at the right time, avoiding any moments of truth depending on the type of survey you have, and ultimately just getting all of that feedback to where then you reduce bias as well by making sure that the information you have is statistically significant. So you increase the amount and the potency of your responses to therefore make even better decisions.
No, that's great. That's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of the right person, the right method, and the right time. I think those are huge. And there's a lot of different types of like methodologies, I think. And, there's just open-ended questions, there's NPS, there's all those types of things. I definitely want to kind of go through these two new methodologies that I think will help folks a lot when it comes to pricing in particular. And there's those two the X and Y axis of that model. So what do people value, and then how much are they willing to pay? Now, when you're thinking about value, a lot of us, what we end up doing is, we'll ask open-ended questions, which I think is great. We'll then ask, some questions on like ranking on scales of 1 to 10. But when you're done with those types of things, it's really, really important to use that information to then guide to something where you're forcing someone to make a decision. And the question that we use in order to do that looks a little bit something like this. So in this case, of the following options, which is least and most important? And the reason that the innovation here, or why this is innovative, is because essentially what's happening is you're forcing that respondent to make a decision. You're not letting them say, I want everything. You're not leaving it super open-ended. But when you're trying to kind of get down from open-ended to more specific, this is a type of methodology that works really, really well. Now, there's tons of other methodologies that you can use. I think there's just a lot of them that end up taking up a lot more time and a lot more effort. But this is one that gives you a lot of bang for your buck, as they say. Because when you do some basic math, and I promise it's pretty straightforward, you get output that looks like this. And so not only am I getting rank order, but I'm also seeing magnitude. So I know that this particular feature is X times more important, or X times, more valuable than these other features. And it's not to say that none of these features, or some of these features, are completely unimportant. It's just that they're less important than the rest of the features that you're surveying on. And when I start to take some segmentation with this data, I can start to realize, oh, interesting, as the company gets bigger, they actually value this more, or they value this less, depending on what the actual feature is. And if I make some assumptions about my personas, meaning for us, Startup Steve was anyone making less than $1 million a year, Mid-Enterprise Mary was a really broad category of anyone making more than $1 million, all of a sudden we're living in a world where I can start to see, okay, if we're going to build for Mary, this is what we need to build, or this is what we need to focus on. If we're going to build for Steve, it's a little bit inconclusive. We probably need to do a little bit more research here. But all of a sudden, with one question, at least for our ProfitWell conundrum, we know that accuracy and depth are going to be really, really important to Mid-Enterprise Meredith. And Startup Steve really cares about design and price, which is not something you really want to see when you're starting out, because design costs a lot of money. And if price is something that they're concerned about, they're not really willing to pay that much. And what's kind of cool is that when you start to cross-reference this with willingness to pay data, you start to get a really, really good data set to start making decisions. And so when I want to go out and I want to figure out how much someone's willing to pay, I'll actually kind of take advantage of something that psychologists and economists have studied for a couple of decades, which is that the human brain, we think about value as a spectrum. So I know, for instance, that this glass of water that I have in front of me is worth less than the computer that I'm presenting on today. And I know that because I've purchased them in the past. The water is really, really plentiful. Computers are plentiful, but not as plentiful, and they cost more. But if I change my scenario, if I put myself in the desert for 3 days without water, all of a sudden that value calculus becomes completely reversed. And so we can take advantage of that by asking ranged questions. So I would ask, at what price point is this product way too expensive that you would never consider purchasing it? At what point is it getting expensive? At what point is it a really good deal? And then at what point is it too cheap that you question the quality of it? And that last question actually can become really, really powerful for some of you, because a good number of us, we undervalue our products pretty significantly. And if I just kind of show you how this data translate, you can kind of see where the power can actually come from. So each of those questions, they correspond to this upper left-hand corner graph, where the furthest line on the right is at what point is it way too expensive, and the furthest line on the left is at what point is it too cheap. But then down in the lower left here, we get what's called the elasticity curve, which is basically the measure of, if I change my price point, how many customers am I expected to lose or gain for this particular segment? And what you'll notice is that if you're at $400 and you actually lower your price to $300, you're not gaining customers, you're actually losing customers. And this is because software, and it's not all software, but a lot of software and a lot of technology that isn't even software, it acts more like a luxury good, like a very, very nice designer bag, or a very, very, expensive bottle of wine in particular case, where as the price actually increases, demand can actually increase to a certain point. And so that's why getting some of this data is so crucial, is because you want to understand kind of where you sit in the market. And what's also kind of interesting is that when you put this in kind of context, and this is what our particular data looked like, you can start to actually understand if you're on the right track. And to kind of skip to the end, the reason that this wasn't too happy for us is because on the low end, we had people willing to pay about $50, and on the high end, we had people willing to pay about $250. But if you know anything about subscription unit economics, that meant that we didn't really have a good opportunity for what's called negative churn, where if someone on the high end churned, we didn't have enough people to basically upgrade during that particular time. And it got a little bit worse when we brought this back to our buyer personas, because when we got some realistic numbers around lifetime value and around customer acquisition cost, all of a sudden we started realizing that wow, like we were going to break even maybe with startup Steve. And for Enterprise Meredith, we were going to be underwater. So basically, we weren't going to be making the money that we were spending to acquire him or her. And what's sad is a lot of us, and we've seen this in a lot of businesses that, have raised hundreds of millions of dollars all the way to, Johnny and Jane startups. A lot of us, what we end up doing is we probably are pursuing a customer that looks like Steve or Meredith in this particular case, because we think that they're going to net out in the future. But a lot of times, unfortunately, what ends up happening is they just never are able to get, into the right CAC model or the right acquisition model. And so fortunately, we kind of knew this was going to start happening. We wanted to validate this data because we had worked with some analytics companies in the past. But we were able to kind of do some research around a different product, which ended up being ProfitWell Retain, which reduces your churn basically by attacking delinquencies and now some active churn aspects. And what you'll notice here is that people who weren't willing to pay $50 for analytics, they're willing to pay for $150 for a particular churn reduction, and then all the way up into like nice 4-figure MRR for the larger companies. And so we had this really, really nice spread here. And so this is what basically influenced us to basically, we had a choice that we could kill ProfitWell, the metrics product, and just build stuff like Retain, or we could figure out, wait, we could probably give away ProfitWell for free, provide a ton of value, and kind of figure out what the cost model could look like to basically get folks to basically, upgrade and use different features that we had. And that's exactly what we did. And to kind of bring that to you and bringing it all together, you're going to get a ton of data, and some of it's going to be a little bit all over the place. Some of it's going to say the same thing. Some of it's going to say differences, and it's still going to be a little confusing. You're still not going to have 100% confidence in everything that you're going to do. There are going to be some things that are just blatantly obvious when you collect data, and there's going to be other things that are going to be still questionable. But what I encourage you to do is just make sure that you're using this data to inform those decisions, because they allow you to basically hedge that understanding. Because A/B testing and multivariate testing pricing is a pretty dicey game, and most of us don't have enough traffic to truly do those multivariate tests. Because even Amazon has some struggles with A/B testing and multivariate testing pricing, and they're getting much more traffic than probably most of us. And so to kind of bring this home a little bit, I would always encourage, and I said this before, you got to start small. There's always more that you can do. This entire analysis for us, and keep in mind we do this for a living, so there's some efficiency there. It took us about 12 hours, and it cost us about $2,100. So that was because of those market panelists. But what was kind of cool, and this is known in hindsight, is that this saved us about 18 months. So what happened, what was really kind of fascinating is one of our competitors, they release all their financial data. So they show you exactly like how much money they're making and things like that. We basically, at the time, we were basically predicting exactly what their ARPU would look like and what their LTV would look like. And we basically avoided kind of going into that market and basically attacking it in the same way everyone else was. And both competitors had come out with free plans. One still has one. One tried it and the infrastructure didn't work out for them. And so it was one of those things that was really kind of interesting, where we kind of saw the future a bit. Now, we didn't know it was the future necessarily, because we were in the same position a lot of you might be, where, all right, I have this data, but it can still, it's not 100%. But it was one of those things where we were able to see enough that we knew kind of what we had to deal with. And to kind of wrap this up a little bit, some other kind of quick fire things that often come up, I would recommend, and we've written on this a lot, make sure you do some quarterly research. And make sure a PM, a product manager, or a marketing manager basically dedicates a day a week, 20% of their time. You can do more. You probably should do more if you're larger. Make sure you're making changes every 6 to 9 months. And this doesn't necessarily mean you're raising your price every 6 to 9 months, but it does mean that you're basically taking on, some sort of change every 6 to 9 months, adjusting your packaging, moving features, those types of things. And this is strictly because it's kind of like once you track something, you can improve it because you're worried about it, you're concerned about it, you're making some changes on it. One thing that's a little controversial, I wouldn't grandfather your pricing, meaning I wouldn't keep your existing customers in the same price point. There are some exceptions to this, but I think that a lot of us, we start off with the idea that this is exactly what we should do. What ends up happening though is once you get from 0 to 10 million, you realize to go to 10 to 100 million, it's going to be extremely difficult to do that unless you raise your prices in some manner on your customers. And you also kind of train your customers to expect more for less. And it's kind of a bad, expectation world to live in. I would use a value metric. This is one thing. If you get this right and you get everything else wrong, normally you're still pretty okay. A value metric is just what you charge for per user, per 100 visits, per 1,000 videos, whatever it ends up being. And the last thing here, and this could be a whole presentation, is that freemium is not a pricing model. Freemium is very much an acquisition model. You should think about freemium as kind of like a premium ebook, less as part of your pricing model. And the most successful freemium models we see, they're introduced either if you have like a top 1% growth person, and I mean like a truly top 1%, or if you end up having someone, or if you end up having 3-4 years of being in business, you understand your customer, and now you just need to open up the top of the funnel.